So because the province has introduced new legislation in Bill 185, it makes urban boundary expansion applications by developers possible at any time outside of what used to be a process through the Municipal Comprehensive Review. So that means, and is happening right now, developers who own land outside the boundary can apply to expand that boundary. And if the city doesn't accept it, and Hamilton is not, because we have committed to a frozen boundary, they can appeal that to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So effectively, it's taking the decision-making away from the city and putting it into a provincial body.
Yeah, and the first thought that struck me when I first saw this draft planning framework is, why do we need this framework? Like, why can't we just say, we've already said we want to reject these proposals? Why do we need to consider them?
Yeah, because we're forced to by the province, right? The city is a creature of the province, and we have to follow legislative processes they've put in place. So we know the game we're in, and now we have to get all the right equipment on in order to play properly and give ourselves the chance of winning.
Awesome. Well, talking about that right equipment, why don't you start your presentation?
Okay. I will get my presentation up here. Just give a moment for that. And let me know when that's coming through on the other end.
All set.
Okay, so as Lucia had said, my name is Craig Kassar. I'm the Ward 12 City Councillor. I've been on council for 2 years, and dealing with implications from provincial legislation has kind of been a theme. And the one we're talking about tonight, of course, is urban boundary expansion. And really, the situation we're in with urban boundary expansion today is what has been in part of regular process in building housing and building cities for many decades since World War II. So I'm going to talk about the implications of urban boundary expansion in this process that's been going on for probably for the entire lives of everyone on this call, and talk about why that's not a good idea and what we can do about it. So let's get in. So the stop sprawl message that I'm pretty sure most everyone on this call is familiar with has been save farmland, no urban boundary expansion. And that was in the last few years as the city and the citizens of the city put pressure on council to adopt a firm urban boundary. And that was successful. And the message was save farmland. And that's a very, very important message. But at this point in time, I think we need to consider, are there other reasons that urban boundary expansion is a bad idea? So that's what I'm going to take you through and give you some tools. So if we step back for a second and think about the city we live in, and what do we want to achieve? What are our city building goals? And we could have a whole long dialogue about it, but I'm going to say, for the sake of argument for tonight, that we want to have sufficient, affordable, and suitable housing. We know we're in a housing crisis, so this is on the mind of all of us in council and probably many of you. We also likely want to have a high quality of life, and that could have many dimensions: social dimensions, economic, health, climate, environment, a whole lot of things. And what we also want, and this is maybe not something that's top of mind for everyone, and the one I'm going to dive into more, is municipal wealth and prosperity. And that doesn't mean individual wealth. It's not talking about income or how much money people have in the bank account. But as a city, can we get the money? Do we have the money to have nice things? Recreation centers, theaters, good roads, all those kind of things. So that's what I mean by municipal wealth and prosperity. So the challenge, probably everyone knows that, as I said, we're in a housing crisis, and the provincial government has mandated, or set a goal, I guess, that Ontario as a province across all municipalities needs to build 1.5 million homes over the next 10 years. And that was starting in 2022. And in the next decade in Hamilton, leading up to 2031, which would be the end of that decade, Hamilton needs to build 47,000 homes. So broken down by year, that's about 4,700 homes every year for 10 years. And in 2023, we surpassed that target. Things have changed in the housing market in 2024, but within 2023, we had a 90% intensification rate, which basically means building housing in already built up areas, not in greenfield areas. There are greenfield areas within the urban boundary that we can build in, but we achieved a goal of 90% of intensification, which is above 80% that the city was aiming for. So there's 3 key points that I'm going to go through: that urban boundary expansion doesn't achieve any of those city building goals that I think we would all have in common. The model of continual urban expansion, as it's happened over many decades, doesn't work, and then some actions you can take. So to give some terminology to it, I call it, and others have called it, the suburban experiment. It's this process that happened after World War II, and North America needed to stimulate the economy. The car was becoming affordable for many people, and we just built out because we had cars that could get us to places faster, more easily. We built out and out and out, and that's the urban boundary expansions that were happening. And it was an experiment, and it's an experiment that's still going on, and I'm going to talk about that experiment and the implications of it. It's built on a faulty premise, I would say. And that premise is we need more land to build more homes, which is how we've operated for 75, 80 years. And right now we're challenging this idea of a land needs assessment for what we need in our city versus a housing needs assessment. And this is what we're talking about in Hamilton. Before, it was just how much land do we need to have to keep doing single family homes, versus now we're thinking about, and thinking back to that 90% intensification rate, what housing do we need? Not just how many units, what quantities, where are they, the price points, all these things that are more nuanced and more detailed versus just how much land do we need to keep doing the same thing we're doing. Because the historical approach to building homes is outdated, and many would agree, as with the finances that I'm going to get into, that's a failed approach to city building. And that's why we should not continue to tolerate that through further urban boundary expansions. So I'll take a pause here. It's a heavy topic. I'll show you a little bit of art I did, well, which is not really art, but this is parking lots. Some of you may have seen a diagram like this before if you were part of the Stop Sprawl movement. What I'm showing here is downtown Hamilton. There's First Ontario Centre, or Cops Coliseum as I still call it. Here at City Hall's down the bottom left. Let's say you're on James Street North, and which is one of the most happening places in Hamilton. Good mixed use there, restaurants, shops, people live there. And you go to a restaurant, and then you have tickets to go to Theatre Aquarius down in the bottom right hand corner here. That's roughly just under a kilometer. So I call this empty city because you're going to be walking there, and 7 of those blocks will have 50% or more of parking lots, which is basically empty space that decades past would have contained buildings. There would have been businesses there, people would have lived there, it would have been generating tax revenue, which speaks to the whole wealth and prosperity for the municipality. But right now they generate very little money. They're not very nice places to visit. They're open, they're windy, and there's nothing happening there, and you can feel unsafe. So this is a consequence of the suburban experiment, because we built out, and now people, when they come in, need to drive and they need somewhere to park. Right? Very simple. We needed to make space. We needed to knock down our city in order for people to come downtown in the city, which is ironic. So here's another one. It's called suburban shopping. So this is actually the Meadowlands Power Center in Ancaster. And just go back again. Look at green as the buildings. All the empty space is dedicated to cars. And this, ironically, was when it was designed, 3 decades or more ago, was supposed to be a mixed-use area with businesses, employment, and residences. But if you've ever been there, there's the Costco, the Home Depot, everything else. And you might say, well, there's some green space here. There's the dog park, there's a soccer field, there's empty space here. This is actually just stormwater management. It's a stormwater management system because of all the pavement that's around everywhere. So you have green areas that can be used, but the space is not being used very well. And it's the product of the suburban experiment and continued urban expansion that's car dependent. Not a good use of land. So we have enough land, right? That's the whole point here. We don't need to continue to expand. We have enough land. We just don't use it very well. There's actually Smart Center operates many power centers in the area. And actually Centennial and Barton, there's actually a proposal to build housing on top of part of the plaza there, which is something that could happen in many situations, just like this power center here in Ancaster. So the point is, we have enough land, we just don't use it very well. And here's an example downtown where we are. We are using it well. It's intensification in action here. So here's Bay Street at Cannon. So there's a Google Earth shot. But what's going in there now is the City Housing Hamilton project. I believe it's even passive housing. There's dozens of units there on a parking lot. So, and there's lots of examples that are happening like that around the city. So, we can do it. So the consequences that we live every day because of the urban boundary expansion that has continued and based on provincial legislation is going to continue. We have traffic congestion. As a councillor, I hear about that a lot. I'm sure many of you have experienced it. That's because of car dependency. You really don't have a choice to get around unless it's in a car. We've had loss of natural areas because we take up so much space and use it very inefficiently. We have to knock down a lot of natural areas, wetlands, that really didn't need to happen. And I referenced earlier the impervious area, which just complicates flooding and erosion and makes it worse. But the big one that I'm going to drill into is that it's financially unsustainable. And I mentioned farmland off the top. That was the message for Stop Sprawl, which is very effective. It's very real. We need to eat. We need to preserve our farmland. But for those that that doesn't resonate with, if you're going to talk to people, the one thing that always resonates is the pocketbook and how much money they have to pay in terms of property taxes. So I think you'll be familiar with the term a Ponzi scheme. The suburban Ponzi scheme is something that has been put together by Strong Towns. If you haven't heard about Strong Towns, I'll be talking about them. And the idea here of a Ponzi scheme is it promises great returns. You recruit new people to pay the old people, the original people with new money. And if you don't have new investors, you have failure. So you have to keep on, it's a pyramid scheme, right? That's another term for it. You have to keep building the base of that pyramid to feed it up, to keep things alive. And essentially that's what's happening in suburban development because they don't pay for themselves. And it's a term from Strong Towns. So a real simple example here. When a new subdivision is built, you have positive cash flow because you have new homes, new taxpayers, property taxes rolling in. So over 25 years, money's just rolling in. But then there's a life cycle to paying for the roads, paying for the rec centers, the lighting, all the things that make up a city, everything underneath the surface and water. And then all of a sudden, when you have to pay for it, you're in a negative cash flow because the problem when we build like this is it doesn't generate enough money to sustain itself. So then what do? Well, we have to get a big influx of cash. So we build out again. And that's got us into a cycle that's problematic. In order to deal with the situation right here in Hamilton, which I'm going to speak to, we'd need an exorbitant tax increase to catch up. You've probably driven on very rough roads and would say, why aren't they being maintained? So we don't have enough money. But we've held taxes artificially low because cost of living is real. We can't put through great tax increases. But I would say we have not invested enough, but we've had a model which we can never invest enough. So we have created hundreds of millions of dollars of unfunded liabilities. And that makes us very cash poor as a city. So the consequences for municipal finances. So every time we build a new asset, which would be, let's use a road as an example. Here's a typical suburban neighborhood on the mountain. We build a road and most of us call that an asset because we own it. That will be paid by development charges, which is what a developer has to pay in order to fund that growth so that existing taxpayers don't take the whole burden. Or developers will just build it outright. That happens as well. But it's not really an asset. It's a forever liability that the city has to maintain. And that's where the problem lies. And it's important to point out, it's not malicious intent. No one's going to do this, because, they're trying to pull a fast one. But in reality, that's what we have to deal with. And it's the model that we've been stuck in. So I mentioned the unfunded liabilities. Our asset management team presented earlier this year that when you look at all our city assets, which are things like roads, water, wastewater, stormwater, rec centers, libraries, playgrounds, lighting, fire stations, it goes on, but you get the idea. We have $380 million in annual unfunded liabilities. That's a huge number. And that means we are not a wealthy city. So the first rule when you're in a hole is stop digging, right? So we know now that we have this huge unfunded liability that we need to figure out how we catch up. And I'm not going to get into that, but City Council has a plan in Hamilton how to do that over 10 years. But we need to stop digging because we're only going to make it worse. Oops. So we have to figure out how to afford what we already have before we take on anything more. If you think about your own personal household budget, you get that. You can't spend more than you have. And if you do, there's consequences that you need to deal with. So we're dealing with those consequences. So that $380 million is a little bit of text at the bottom of the screen there, but I thought it deserved to be shown large because it's a huge number. $380 million annually is what we don't have to fund what we need to fund to keep our city maintained. And that equates, if roughly, if we were going to just snap our fingers and get the money, a 35% property tax increase, which is not going to happen. It's not sustainable. That would be a very, very bad decision because it'll bankrupt a lot of people and create other problems. However, that just gives you an idea of the reality of the situation. So, building a strong town, coming back to the Strong Towns organization I mentioned, and I should have mentioned, if you're not familiar with them, they're a U.S. Grassroots organization that, this is their bread and butter, and looking at how you build a financially sustainable, vibrant city. So to summarize what I said earlier, urban boundary expansion would just continue the same mistakes that we've making for the past 75 years. So that's important, that we get this framework right and we arm ourselves with the right equipment in order to not keep repeating the same mistakes. And I also want to point out, this is not on residents living in the suburbs. For those of us that live in a single family home, we just really haven't had much choice. It's not a political thing. It's not ideology. It's just, this is a financial hole that we've dug ourselves in. So no one should feel guilty. I live in a single family home because that was the choice that was available to me. But what we need to do is reconcile the lifestyles we've come to see as the standard with what we need to achieve sustainability. And of course, that's environmental sustainability, the climate, but it's also just sustainability on how to financially, like I've talked about, how do we get the right homes in the right sizes and the right locations at the right price points? Because we're out of balance. There are many different needs around the city. I have kids in the late teens and early 20s, and there's no chance that they're going to be moving out anytime soon because they couldn't afford it. So, the housing choices aren't right. They're not the right choices of rentals and to be able to purchase. We just don't have enough to meet housing needs for the people who want it, as well as people who are aging. You have, as I do, I have an older relative who lives in a single family home on their own. You can probably think of many individuals that you may know that do. Maybe they've grown old there. When a spouse has died, they're in a 3-bedroom home and by themselves, we put supports around them and that's okay. But when you zoom out and look at that societally, you have all this unused capacity and there's really no options for them to age in place in their community because all there is single family homes. So on both ends of the spectrum, we're not really serving the community. So to hit on the financial part of it, there's a firm called Urban 3 in the States that looks at the financial productivity of cities. And what you can see here is a map of the cost of service analysis that they do. So where there's tall bars here, that means it's a very financially productive area. And I'll show you what that looks like. It looks like a skyscraper here, but that's not what that is. And the areas that are below the horizon here are net negative. They are, like I mentioned before, they are a net negative financial drain on the city. And that's basically single family sprawl. So when you put that together and you can understand that it is not financially sustainable to build the way we've been building. So this picture is a representation of what that high financial productive area looks like. They're just generally main streets in a town that have mixed use. They're dense, they have shops, they're generally pleasant to be, which is sort of like many Europeans countries. You never hear someone come back from a European country and said, wow, I hated how great it was walking to all the nice shops and being able to get around on foot. But we don't do that in North America, and to our financial detriment. So what we need to not be continuing to expand our urban boundary. We need to have density within the urban boundary. And the key point here is we really need to maximize our tax revenue per acre. If we're going to make up that financial gap, if we're going to build wealth and prosperity in our city, we need to change the way we're doing things. And we can change the way we're doing things and actually make it a pleasant place to live. The other thing I'll mention here is we don't need a war on cars. That's probably a term you've heard before. There is not a war on cars, but what we want to reject is car dependency. People should have options. If you want to drive and you need to drive, you should be able to drive. Not everyone can get around on public transit, on a bike or walking. So we need to enable people to drive, but it shouldn't be your only choice. So if we build our cities differently, reject urban boundary expansions that have continued, and focus on intensification, we get less infrastructure that we have to build and maintain. We get more complete communities. We create the conditions for high frequency transit. A lot of people today won't consider taking transit because it doesn't come very often. The service isn't great. The routes aren't great. Hamilton's starting to work on that. We have a vision we're implementing over the next few years to do that. But the more density you have, the better transit you can have. And then, there's improved social connectivity. If you see people more, better mental and physical health. I won't get into those, but this more housing choices is really, really important given the housing crisis we're in, and ultimately a more affordable city. So there's a lot of benefits if we change the way we're doing things. So to bring that back to the city building goals I mentioned up the front, of course, no surprise, urban boundary expansion option doesn't hit any of these marks. A frozen urban boundary intensifying within the city does, for all of these reasons. And the other thing I'll point out, resources to build homes and the labor to do it and the time to do it is all limited. So if we're going to focus on building inefficient single family homes with new infrastructure that take up a lot of land, take up a lot of labor, we're actually not going to get the housing that we need, and not the types of housing, not the price points. So we just need to consider all of these things, and they all point to the fact that we need to change the way we're doing things and work within our urban boundary. So to wrap it up for my part of this, some key actions here. One, we need to talk to each other. We need to explain to others why it matters to them, why it should matter to them. And so spread the message. A great tool, or two great tools to use, are strongtowns.org. I mentioned them. And then maybe you're familiar with Not Just Bites on YouTube. They actually have a whole playlist about strong towns. There are 5 to 10-minute videos explaining more about strong towns. I've given you a little flavor, but educate yourself and talk about the financial impact. It's not just about farmland, which is of course important, but everyone can understand and feel the hit to the pocketbook. Engage Hamilton right now has on the website a way for you to provide input on the framework for processing these and evaluating urban boundary expansion applications. And there are also public information sessions, which I know Lucia is going to touch on more later, but there's 3 happening in the next couple of weeks around the city. And then the third thing, which is a little more midterm, is a group of people are going to be launching a Strong Towns Hamilton, which is basically a local group for people to connect and talk about these topics and how they can implement them, how they can be effective in Hamilton. Not dissimilar to Hamilton 350 Environment Hamilton, but focusing on the strong town concepts that I've mentioned here today. So there's a number of ways you can get involved, and hopefully there's something in there that you can take an action with. So I'll wrap it up there, Lucia.
Well, before I let you go, Craig, I wanted to ask a couple questions, and then I'll also just mention very briefly a question in the chat that I thought was good.
Sure.
First off, you touched on a lot of things, both financial, flooding, things that affect everybody in Hamilton. One of the things in the draft urban boundary expansion talks about notification. And one of the things we've heard in the past is this idea that only the people who live around the urban boundary expansion should be notified and involved in the process. Is that your view? I mean, certainly from where I sit downtown, my water is affected by what happens on the mountain, and my streetscape, as you've just shown, right? I've done that empty walk between James and Theatre Aquarius, and it's not for me because I'm walking, right? It's for other people. So I feel affected. Do you think that there's avenues for everyone in Hamilton to continue to be part of this advocacy?
Yeah, there absolutely is, and getting involved in the groups we've talked about is one way. And there's a list, and it'll come to me that the mailing list from the city of Hamilton that you can sign up for to get notification, because provincial legislation doesn't require more than the bare minimum that you mentioned. But you're right that all these decisions do affect everyone in the city. So we need to make sure each other is aware and can have input. So I know Nancy is on the meeting here. Maybe Nancy, if you can put the email address to sign up to make sure that people can get notified.
That would be good. We'll loop back to that afterwards. Another quick question, just based on what was popping up in the chat, is that in terms of talking to people, and I'm not going to ask you to talk about any of your council colleagues specifically, but in terms of getting decision makers on board, this is something that's happened in the past with Stop Sprawl movement. It needs to happen again going forward. Do you find that, you were saying financial arguments are really, really popular? Like, what do you think works to get decision makers on side with taking what's going to be maybe a bit of a spicy position in Hamilton, as we're a leader when it comes to keeping our urban boundary firm?
Yeah, well, whatever the topic is, understanding where that person is coming from and what's important to them is, how you need to approach it. And that's why I speak to the financial part of it, because, generally everyone cares about money and cost of living, and cost of living is a huge problem right now. So I think it's really understanding your audience and keeping it simple, because, there is resistance to change. I've talked to a lot of people who, yeah, this has worked for us and, it's fine. I like my privacy. I like being on a cul-de-sac, but it's trying to get people to start to understand the implications of that, but understanding where they're coming from so that you can, address your argument in a way that's going to be meaningful to them.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Craig. I'm going to pass it on over to Phil to talk to us about, now that we understand the why, again, a refresher on why we can't continue to sprawl. How does Hamilton keep our firm urban boundary?
Oh, thanks for having me here. I wonder, can folks see the slide? Can folks see a slide that we've shared?
Yes, I can.
So I want to start by saying, this seems a little bit like deja vu, because 3.5 years ago, we were in a similar situation, more than 3.5 years ago. And, a lot of the feeling was the same, that somehow, the system was rigged in order to drive through an urban boundary expansion. We were hearing from staff that really there was no alternative, and that Hamilton would have to extend the settlement boundary. And really, this is actually attempt number 3 by the provincial government to impose a settlement boundary expansion on Ontario. And what that means is that, you guys, all of us together, to some extent, we have defeated this attempt twice, despite the government having thought that it had things neatly sewed up, tightly tied up with a bow on it, in such a way that there was no way to avoid boundary expansion. So the first time they attempted to impose boundary expansion through the land needs assessment methodology changes, and through this behind the scenes arm twisting, which took the form of things like a letter from the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing claiming that a particular interpretation of the rules had to be followed. And guess what? That was defeated. They brought the evidence before council, and council was able to say no to that settlement area boundary expansion. That happened in November 2021, May 2022. And then number 2, after all that, after the victory at Hamilton Council, the minister, having failed in trying to strong arm Hamilton into acquiescing through the back door, the minister had to try and do it all out in the open. And they directly tried to impose settlement boundary expansion, and that was defeated. So this is attempt number 3. And so remember, just as the rules have been changed now, and it was thought that this makes it impossible to avoid a settlement boundary expansion, let's remember that that was the same logic that was applied the first time around. So the first time around, staff and was rightly pointed out that the new Doug Ford government at the time had lowered intensification requirements, they lowered minimum greenfield densities, they had attempted to pass off historical mixes of housing types as propensities that had to be continued. At that time, we defeated the government by demonstrating that there was political support for meeting all of the identified housing needs, not refusing to meet the need, not saying we care more about the environment and therefore we're not going to build more housing, but there was a political commitment to build more than 80% of new housing within Hamilton's existing neighborhoods, which really represented, you know, a radical departure from certainly what the government was expecting would be old-fashioned NIMBYism, where the easy thing to do would be to put new growth and sprawl. By rallying support, by building consensus around people willing, in the broad sense, to accept density and major change within their neighborhoods, we were able to have a legally supportable, viable proposal for zero boundary expansion that council was able to support. And then after that, having failed to force it through the back door, the Minister Clark tried the direct route. And so they literally took the official plan and marked out the parts of the official plan pertaining to a firm urban boundary. They just crossed out sections of that firm urban boundary. We held them off using a couple of tactics. As you recall, Environmental Defense participated in a judicial review of that decision. And it was our position at the time that it would be unreasonable for the minister to conclude under the old rules that it was necessary to expand settlement boundaries in order to meet housing need based on all the evidence that we put before the minister. So that was the legal strategy. But the political strategy, and this is key because it's now going to be the linchpin of your legal strategy, is that we had to, in order to paint the story of the corruption underlying the forced boundary expansion, in order to get the government to pay attention to that, we had to start by saying that, you know, there's a strong case to be made that actually extending the settlement area boundary would slow down housing output. And only by making the case that this is actually going, not just going to sacrifice the environment, but it's going to produce fewer homes overall, were we able to get the media and you know, public opinion makers to start to see that this is not about competing trade-offs. This is about an inexplicable decision by the government to, on the pretext of increasing housing output, to do something that's going to deliver fewer homes and harm the environment. And so that work, that framing, and the development that we've done around that argument is really going to have to be the linchpin of a successful fight against settlement boundary expansion now. So in winning those two earlier fights, we were able to rely on a couple provisions of the PPS and the growth plan. So in particular, at the time, there was a ban on settlement boundary expansions unless it was proven to be necessary. There was a comprehensive MCR process, which meant you weren't going to have all these separate little settlement boundary expansions or separate big settlement boundary expansions that had to be dealt with and that would overwhelm staff or that would prevent Hamilton from looking at the big picture. And number three, even though the intensification rates and density minimums had been lowered, there still were some of those on the books. So those things, it's as though the government looked at the statutory and PPS provisions that made our argument, that made it impossible for them to win in those first two pieces. And they said, well, these are a problem. So we're just going to take them out of the law altogether so that no one can argue that we don't need the settlement boundary anymore. That's not a reason to say no. And that they can't, or it'll be harder or less practical for them to do the big picture analysis and say, well, if we add settlement boundary here, we're going to lose something somewhere else. The good news is that we still, just as they thought they had things tied up those first 2 times, and they were wrong. They're still wrong. There are still things in this provincial quote unquote planning statement, inferior as it is, that provide a clear basis for saying no to settlement boundary expansion if Hamilton makes the right moves, and in the Planning Act itself. Planning Act still requires that Hamilton have and the minister have regard to matters of provincial interest, including adequate provision of servicing, support for development in patterns that will support public transit and pedestrians, and provision of an adequate and full range of housing. And it must still now be consistent with this new document called the Provincial Planning Statement. The growth plan is gone. The provincial policy statement is gone, but there's this new, weaker document called the Provincial Planning Statement that still has some gestures to good policy in there. So there are policies like promoting densities which efficiently use land, supporting the use of active transportation, making efficient use of resources, infrastructure, and public service facilities. And in settlement area boundary decisions, there is no requirement that they demonstrate need, but they still do need to consider need to some extent. What that means is that if there is a need, then it's open to the minister to ignore everything else and say, well, you still need more land in order to keep up with demand. But that means that if you can show that the settlement boundary expansion will make it harder to keep up with demand, then you've neutralized that piece. You have to, you're supposed to prioritize putting housing where there's existing infrastructure capacity. And you still can't do settlement area boundary expansion if there's no infrastructure planned at all. So that means that we have to turn that political strategy that we used to fight the forced settlement boundary expansion into the substantive policy and legal strategy of Hamilton in defeating settlement area boundary expansion. So here's the argument that we need to make now. Every home built in settlement area boundary expansion land would be coming at the expense of a larger number of homes within a similar demand category in existing built-up area. We want to see there's not enough construction or infrastructure capacity to build enough homes and still build on the settlement area boundary expansion land. You can't have both. This is not a yes and. And then number two, we have to show that there are far more, in order to make that happen, we have to show there are far more viable to build units in the same demand categories that are already permitted as of right in Hamilton's existing built-up area that are required to use up Hamilton's entire construction infrastructure capacity. So you want to say that we've already approved enough units in Hamilton's existing built-up area such that we expect that if there is no settlement boundary expansion, that development in Hamilton's existing built-up area will suck up every bit of construction we have, every bit of infrastructure that we can commit, and we have to be able to meet housing need in the same demand categories. So that means that we can't just say, oh, we're going to build a whole bunch of small apartments. We have to have a path to be building family-sized units as infill. Number three, it's not sufficient in order to accomplish this that Hamilton be able to say that it is technically permitted enough of these units in the right mix of housing types. I mean, Hamilton or the City of Toronto has many times the number of units that will be needed for the City of Toronto, technically in the pipeline, in the sense of having been approved or or at some stage of approvals, but they are not units that are actually viable to build. In order to discharge this kind of part of the argument and win, Hamilton has to be able to show that there are enough units that are legal and practical to build at low enough cost that would allow for rents and sale prices that someone would actually pay, at costs that would make it politically viable for governments to fund them in a non-market development format. So this means that Hamilton can't just theoretically prove things, but they have to think and Hamilton has to turn its mind in order to win this argument to driving down the costs that are associated with complying with the rules. And again, we want to show settlement boundary expansion would mean fewer homes slower. So here is the challenge that we have. And frankly, this diagram or something like it is the diagram that Build and your opponents will be bringing to the table when they lobby the premier, and certainly will be in the back of the minds of the OLT if there's an appeal. So right now, the construction costs for infill, and if this is, for example, mid-rise, but generally on a per square foot basis, under some of our current rules, the construction costs are higher on a per square foot basis than for other forms of development. But that's only true in the Greater Toronto area, in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and to some extent in the USA. It's not anything inherent in infill development. It's not anything inherent in mid-rise development. These are artificially inflated costs as a result largely of the provincial government's own policies that municipal governments have simply accepted. And Hamilton has the power to fix those. So number one, Hamilton can lower land costs. So the great thing, and I'll dig into this a little bit, Hamilton's already doing this, and you can talk about how you're doing this. You're creating as of right permission to build mid-rise in places where it's actually viable to build, and where it's viable to build family-friendly, family-sized mid-rise buildings. That's existing, currently low-rise residential streets that are zoned residential. Number two, you need to legalize labor-efficient designs and methods for mid-rise. You need to lower carrying and procedural costs to speeding up approvals processes, and lower some of the fees and taxes and charges for mid-rise, so that for the equivalent unit, if you're building it as mid-rise infill with an existing neighborhood, whether it's an apartment or a townhome or a garden suite, but especially a mid-rise unit, you should always be charging a much lower development charge for infill in an existing low-rise residential neighborhood than you are on greenfield, or frankly, even in the downtown. So the good news is, so we've just released a report because we anticipate that this is going to be a problem all over Ontario on how to accomplish this. It's called the Mid-Rise Manual. It is a step-by-step guide to all levels of government, and we're really pushing provincial parties as well, but Hamilton's municipal government and other municipal governments on how to accomplish that. It's at legalizemidrise.ca. And the great thing is, the number one, the hardest, but the most important step, you're already working on through your mid-rise residential zones project. And that is to create as of right permission to build infill housing, mid-rise, in places where it's actually viable to build. That means you should be proactively rezoning for as of right 6 stories on residential zoned arterials and collectors as quickly as you can. So get that locked in, bang that process through as quickly as possible. Everyone on this call, everyone who wants to stop settlement area boundary expansions should be pushing loudly and as hard as they can, flooding the meetings, because defeating settlement area boundary expansion, step one to that is making sure that this happens. And it needs to happen before any settlement area boundary expansion request gets before the OLT, ideally. So that means rush this and brush aside opposition, slam every meeting, fill them with people to show that there will be thousands and thousands of units already with as of right zoning permission. And so what we're looking for here is not, this is a residential neighborhood. Residential neighborhood is not just low-rise homes, but it's a mix of low-rise and mid-rise buildings. But we also have to legalize in order to demonstrate that it's going to be viable to build all these units and stop up the demand and undermine the case for settlement area boundary expansion. You have to make it legal to build at lower costs. So that means that for mid-rise buildings, there should be no minimum parking requirement. These are all steps, and it's not that you have to get every single one of these in order to win, but the more you get, the stronger the case goes. Like, the stuff you're already doing, I think, I would be happy arguing that you don't need a settlement area boundary expansion, but, with the rules the way they are, you're safest doing all of these things. Eliminate minimum parking requirements, no step back requirements for buildings of 6 stories or less. You're allowed to build a 6-story box on any of these infill residential lots. No special loading requirements for mid-rise buildings that you wouldn't apply to low-rise. And you want to speed up the process. So right now we have a kind of perverse system where the most environmentally damaging and wasteful use of a lot is simpler, much less complicated, and much less time-consuming than the process to do the right thing for the environment on that lot, which is to build a mid-rise building. So the goal here should be that it's not really any more complicated to get development approval for a mid-rise building than it would be to get approval for a large McMansion on the same lot. So you want to provide as of right zoning. That means it's already allowed, no rezoning required to do 6 stories straight up. Simplified application requirements. You want a dedicated team within Hamilton's planning staff whose goal is to make these things happen, to be a friend to whoever wants to do these things because Hamilton wants them done. You want a centralized database of existing conditions information so that rather than having to have studies done from scratch, for each of these developments, you've kind of got an off-the-shelf set of conditions already. And so this is another one. You want to shift. You want to have a much lower rate of development charges for a mid-rise infill building, an equivalent sized unit in a mid-rise infill building, than you would for greenfield development or for low-rise development that's infill. You want to harmonize the tax rates for multi-residential and low-rise ownership housing. And you want to and this is important to the infrastructure piece of the test now. You want Hamilton to just say, right now, our goal is not just to allow this mid-rise to happen, but we are planning on the basis, and we're putting our infrastructure into planning to actually have our arterials and collectors converted to mid-rise within a particular time horizon. And you just get on proactively with any upgrades to sewer or water that you would need in order to accommodate that. And you shouldn't need all that much because there's a lot of existing capacity in those low-rise neighborhoods, but you should be planning proactively to do whatever, to deal with any weak links or bottlenecks. And so you can just say, listen, this is how we're doing it, and you get on with it. Yeah, so those are the big ones. Again, this is a bit dry, but guess what? It was a bit dry the first time around when we did it. You should see what that report looked like. It was exactly the same kind of weird technical arguments, and I think you have to approach it that way. These are the hoops that Hamilton is going to have to jump through to reliably win this. And so that we've been working on that. We commissioned SVN and LGA to develop a roadmap so that any municipality can reliably win all of their fights against settlement area boundary expansion. Do these things, and I think you've got all these things, and I think you got a slam dunk case. Do most of these things, and I think you still have a strong case.
Awesome, thanks, Phil. And I'm sure Craig probably has a few things to say about what Hamilton is doing on some of that roadmap. Before that, though, I've got some questions for you about this roadmap to winning. I'm going to quickly share my screen to show you the map and show everyone on this call the map of the urban boundary expansion areas. Just making sure you guys can see that. If someone can say so out loud, that would be great.
So these are the ones that we're you have applications for, you're expecting applications for.
I believe both. I think applications are already starting to roll in. And
Yeah.
one of the things about this map, which shows the two different potential uses for the area. So you can see that there is both employment lands because of the proximity to the airport and residential lands that, or yeah, I mean, they could be employment too, but these areas here in purple, the bottom line is that we don't expect residential uses. What we're probably looking at is warehouses. And what can Hamiltonians do for those areas, for that type of use, to make sure that we also line up the hoops and that we jump through them properly?
Yeah. So, there was a bit of discussion, and certainly in the original fight, we did talk about this. And I think, again, it's about proactively, not waiting for applications, not waiting for someone to ask you, but going ahead and providing a kind of a simplified path to a much denser way to do warehousing. So if you look at Hong Kong, if you look at France, if you look at Europe, this model, like what we're doing in Brampton now with these big horizontal, Amazon facilities, there are 8, 9, 18-story buildings where all of those processes are stacked elsewhere. So I think Hamilton should be pursuing a set of planning studies designed to facilitate and promote verticalized warehousing and logistics. And that's important too, because a lot of this is being presented as employment, but the tactic for the companies that are doing this is that, if you say, oh, the employment density is going to be X, their goal is to eliminate most of the human employment from these facilities within a fairly short, like a 10-year time horizon. So this means that really it does make sense to plan that verticalized design, and that verticalized design works very well with the automation that they're trying to do anyway. So just talk of, really push Hamilton's verticalization of warehousing and logistics, develop some models of, like little diagrams of how you're going to do it, work out all your circulation and everything, so that it's actually a practical, doable thing and not an abstraction when you say, we don't nearly need so much land for industrial because it's all going to be vertical, and this is our model for what warehousing is going to look like in Hamilton in the future.
Gotcha. So just to follow in on that roadmap for the residential side, if I understood, the things that we can advocate for next week in the upcoming planning sessions, what do you think are the strongest criteria that we can require developers to put forward, particularly around things like lifetime infrastructure costs, or their modeling that indicates that there's the demand that will help us to say, hey, we've already done the work and it turns out that we've approved the units, it's not going to pay for itself, all that sort of stuff. Like, what information do we need to make sure that they provide in their applications so that we can show that we've already done the work and that it's not lining up?
Number one, any piece of land, right? There should not be a single hectare or half acre of land approved for development that cannot be developed to a floor of at least 100 people per hectare. There needs to be a sufficient density to support frequent, reliable public transit, or you just don't develop it at all. So a density floor, and the other advantage of that is, of course, yet less of the land gets eaten up as quickly, the more people there are per sector. So the idea is it's a floor. It's not that you're going to permit a higher density, but that you do not permit anything less than a certain density for this greenfield development. The number two is that there should be some kind of model for demonstrating that there should be a construction labor management regime, and so there should be some lens of demonstrating that this greenfield development will not be competing with infill development within existing neighborhoods for labor pool, and like you have a framework. So you create that analytical framework from the outset, so it's not an argument you're making after the fact. Yeah, those are a couple of big ones. Yeah, I think, and those are consistent. Those are the strongest, that they fit and are most rationally connected with what remains of the planning regime. So the provincial planning statement and the growth plan for the greater, and the provincial planning statement and the planning act itself.
Mhm. And given this current approach where cities have a 120-day timeline to get back, you know, it really sort of primes cities to be overwhelmed and for developers to tactically overwhelm cities with these applications.
Well, I know, you know, I don't want to talk out of school, but I know that your legal department is overtaxed. I know that your planning staff are overstretched. And frankly, it's true all across the regions where developments happen. That's 100% intention of these changes, is to have such a volume of material. And you saw it already. Like Steve Robichaud's original response to the original settlement boundary extension was very much based on this history of just feeling like you couldn't win. And so the way around that, again, I think, is through proactive approaches. So, you know, rather than having to kind of construct bespoke planning arguments against settlement area boundary expansion, I think you should be centrally working on the argument that we have so much development in the pipeline that we cannot afford to waste any capacity on sprawl. And so you're building that argument both substantively through substantive policy change, but also through you're building this centralized report, but like you're building a case that our capacity is going to be overstretched, that we have construction labor shortages, and all these things. And you have that central thing that you then apply, and that can be applied in a generalized way to those individual settlement area boundary applications.
Yeah, so, you know, having that one time done roadmap, we're going to hit our 47,000 housing units. They're going to be affordable. They're going to be infill. It's not hypothetical that it could happen. It's in the pipeline for approval. That's
I would say also that it's not just in the pipeline. So, because in the pipeline does not mean that they're going to be built. There are hundreds of thousands of units that are in the pipeline in Ontario that cannot be built because they don't pencil. So when you say 47,000 units, your goal should be to have 100,000 units in the pipeline, and you should be doing economic modeling yourself, right? So the Toronto, with its EHAN major expanding housing options in neighborhoods, major streets proposal, they actually model like, okay, could you borrow money and build based on like current construction costs and still comply with these rules and be able to turn a profit and pay back your loan, or would you lose money? And where they found that, oh, actually you might lose money on this, they actually came back and they changed the rules to say, okay, we wanted to require this, but if it means that we're not going to get as many units, then we're going to loosen up those requirements. So do that modeling proactively, so you can say, yeah, we know that it's going to be viable to build these things, that it's going to be profitable. And I don't mean that we're just relying entirely on the market model, because even if you're building non-market housing, someone's got to pay for it. It's the government that's got to pay for it. And you have to get the cost of building low enough that it's politically viable to build the number of units you want to build. So, in the GTA, sometimes a bachelor unit in some jurisdictions can cost almost $500,000 to build, even on free public land. So in that context, if we need, tens or hundreds of thousands of units, that's a lot of money, and people balk at the idea of paying that for a bachelor unit. So you have to get the number down, even if you just want a public builder and let's do it all on market. That's got to be part of the solution. So either way, the city has to attack that financial viability question.
Right. Craig, is there anything that you wanted to say in response to Phil's presentation?
Yeah, just some general comments. Lots of good content in there, and there's many things that Hamilton is already doing. For example, eliminating parking minimums as an example. Well, overall, residential developments throughout the city have had parking minimums reduced, and in the downtown and many parts of the lower city, there are actually no parking minimums required, or the minimum is zero parking because it's more transit oriented. Hamilton actually allows accessory dwelling units, or granny suites are called, secondary dwelling units. They have many names. So up to 4 units could be on a single residential lot, whether that's a garage, basement, a detached dwelling in the backyard. And that's starting to ramp up as people take advantage of that. And then looking at transit oriented corridors, which upzone and allow more density. For example, we're looking now at Upper James, turning that into a transit oriented corridor. So we've just approved to go public and get input on that, enabling just more density and changing the way the city's shape. So many more things we can do, but I think in Hamilton, we are definitely focused on doing many of the things Phil is saying, but there's more work to be done for sure.
I would really encourage Hamilton to pursue, because we work with Mayor Chow in Toronto on her approach. And rather than having all these individual fights over densification that are piecemeal, look what we did on getting public approval for 80% intensification rate. It was all together, all at once. That's the value of the MCR type model. And we said, let's apply that to upzoning as well. And it looks like you do have a process similar to that. But so let's just say upzone every single residential, like every single arterial and collector all at once. Bam, one big shot. And then you can mobilize your stop sprawl group to jam those meetings the same way as you did the settlement area boundary expansion meeting. It's much harder to do if you're doing it project by project piecemeal, right? So you want to directly connect the fight to stop settlement boundary expansion to we need to force this through, so that you just get you turn all of your tools for organizing, you combine them into a singular issue and get it done all at once. So we got, I think it was something like 36,000 very large residentially zoned lots in the city of Toronto, zoned for mid-rise buildings of between 30 and 60 units all at once in one process at the city of Toronto. And I think that's the model that Hamilton should be doing. That's the model that can deliver change fast enough to really with great confidence be able to say, yeah, they're going to use up every bit of capacity. Look how much they're building. They don't have anything to spare for your sprawl development.
Awesome. So before I turn it over to the Q&A from the chat, I'm just going to share very quickly and show everyone what is upcoming next week in terms of providing comment to the city. So this is the page on Engage Hamilton for the framework for processing and evaluating urban boundary expansion applications. The lead on this project is planner Charlie Tillman, and as Nancy put in the Q&A earlier, urbanboundary@hamilton.ca is the email you can email to be added to the email list to get notified about all of this stuff. There's a backgrounder video along with some history resources, and then very importantly, open houses, including 3 in-person and 1 virtual open house. The first 2 of which are next week. And they're located across Hamilton. So there's one downtown at the convention center that runs all day, 12 to 9. Then there's one at Ancaster High Secondary School in the evening on November 28th. And then on December 3rd at Gatestone Elementary School, also in the evening, along with a virtual open house that runs in the evening of December 5th. You can sign up to RSVP so that they know how many folks to expect at these events. And you can also comment here on this PDF. You can see it's already full of lots of comments from the public. Let's make sure that our feedback is in these documents. Let's make sure we're turning up to these meetings and taking the knowledge that we've got from Phil and Craig tonight and putting it into practice to advocate that Hamilton take those positions. So turning to take some of these Q&A. Here's a bit of a general question, and I'm going to direct this at you, Phil. is that is there possibly a province-wide way to push back on some of these planning changes? Is there anything that can be done looking at the way that it's restricting people's transportation choices, where they're working, where they're living? Is there any way that the health impacts and safety impacts and the impacts on people's lives can be challenged at a provincial level?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, at the provincial level, there are great opportunities for activism. I think we have, at least we believe we have, commitments from the opposition parties that they would reverse all of these policy changes that are allowing case-by-case settlement area boundary expansion applications to happen at all. We are pushing for reforms to the Greenbelt in view of the government's attack on settlement area boundary expansion that would expand the Greenbelt to absorb this white belt land as well, to take this issue of having to deal case by case with settlement boundary expansion requests off the table. It's not great in some ways, but it really does look like there's going to be a fresh provincial election early next year. And so this means that there's a real opportunity leaning on the opposition, but also just turning this issue against the government and forcing them to make a U-turn on this policy. So the government, for the past 4 or 5 years, they have been consistently saying that everything they're doing, from their attacks on conservation authorities to some of the settlement area boundary expansions to the growth plan for the Golden Horseshoe, that really did. Hamilton fought it, but every other part of the region, they did have considerable settlement boundary expansions. There's subsidization of greenfield sprawl development. They claimed that all of this would get more homes built faster. And that narrative has been completely discredited. And they've had to admit it themselves. They promised 1.5 million homes by 2031. And they've admitted 2 weeks ago in their own fall economic statement that they're nowhere near on track to achieving that. That 5 years out from now, or that in 2031, they will be building half the rate of home construction that they promised that we would. So they're in a failed position. So we can say, hey, your approach didn't work. There's a good reason to turn things on its head. So there's a real opportunity here. And so we would, if you go to legalizemidrise.ca, we'd encourage you to go to that document. And we have an action there where we're pushing all of the provincial party leaders and MPPs and platform development groups to include these measures to reverse the settlement area boundary expansions and make these mid-rise changes all at once from top down provincially. And so I think that's the best thing you can do in the short term, and obviously participate in the election.
Great. Craig, I've got a question for you. Talking about flooding and water security in Hamilton. I know recently when you joined Environment Hamilton for our climate justice bike ride, we were talking about how, and correct me if I'm wrong, about 50% of Hamilton's surface is impermeable. And that's putting huge stress on not only our combined sewer and wastewater management systems, but also on our watersheds and our water quality locally. And one of the questions that we've received is whether or not it would be possible to create some sort of centralized database that looks at those cumulative impacts and costs, that allows, when these applications come in, to say, oh, you're adding X number of cubic, square meters of asphalt. This is how much that's going to cost us. Is there any work like that being done to put these costs maybe in alignment with some of the stormwater work that Hamilton's been doing that we could reuse again and again as modeling for these expansions?
Really good question. I think the short answer is no, we're not that sophisticated. We have recognized that the funding model that we have in place for stormwater doesn't work, and that's why we're looking at a stormwater fee. Not sure in the path and how we would get to be that sophisticated. It is a great idea, but just as an example, if anyone was down at the waterfront this summer, you saw the blue-green algae impact, and that's not a point source problem. To the question that was asked, that's because water washes out over the pavement, all the paved areas, into our watersheds, and creates that problem at the waterfront because, you know, you have hotter days, more sun, and, you know, nutrient-rich water. So yeah, the issue is real. I don't think we're at a point on, well, we don't measure that now. It'd be a great place to get to. I'm not sure that that's something we can do in the short term, as valuable as that idea would be.
On the short term, there's also some questions from Don McLean, who's familiar to most people on this call. There's a bit of a back and forth talking about how close is Hamilton to actually differentiating development charges to reflect the cost of greenfield versus infill development.
And that question's come up before, and I had addressed that at some point. And we do not, and I don't believe we're able, if I remember correctly, to differentiate development charges based on the area of the city. And I believe that's because of provincial legislation. I don't know if Phil can validate or correct that, but I remember that we did deal with that, and there wasn't a path to what I recall.
I lost that. Could you repeat what you were going to ask me to verify, Craig?
For development charges, if they can be at different rate depending on what part of the city, greenfield versus an existing urban boundary, or outside the urban boundary versus inside the urban boundary.
I think certainly there are bifurcated development charges or distinctive development charge regimes for different areas in other jurisdictions. I think it depends on the design. You know, there might be some designs of the development charge regime that might fall afoul of the law, but there's certainly, you know, different standards for different types of development.
Yeah, we do for commercial versus industrial versus residential for sure. But yeah, no, thank you for the prompt, and it's maybe something I'll take offline and see what I can confirm.
You know, development charges are, in fact, the developers themselves are complaining about this, you know, that they are being saddled with development charges in cases where the infrastructure already exists. There's existing infrastructure capacity. Why, if you were building in a low-rise neighborhood that has lost population over the years and therefore has existing sewer capacity, has existing sidewalks, why are you paying the same rate as if you're building, let's say, even on a brownfield location where they have to build new sewers and sidewalks? You know, it doesn't make sense. It's not really fair. So the sensible thing is to, the government's whole argument on development charges is that you should be tailored to the actual costs of supporting the development. And so as long as your changes are with that in mind, and also say, you know, one thing I think you can factor in is, are they getting you closer to a density that is sufficient to support replacement of existing infrastructure? So you can discount development from development charges based on the idea that you'll have a larger tax base to support stuff that couldn't be supported by development charges because they're not incremental demand of the new development.
Great. I'm going to move it to our last two questions because we're running to the end of our time. One from Ginny in the chat here talking about the loss of farmland. We all agree, I know we all agree with that. Farmland needs to be protected. What could be done to really sort of look at that prime agricultural farmland, class 1, 2, and 3 soil? And at a municipal level, are there any tools we can pull on to try to protect that land in particular?
I think one piece of feedback you can give during these town halls or the public sessions or online is making sure we're using the right measurement, because there's different ways to evaluate farmland. And I believe it's a CLI, Canada Land Inventory, which actually is the more robust method, you know, that gives a higher value to prime farmland, class 1, 2, and 3 versus other methods. So that's one piece of input you can provide, is make sure that in the framework we're using Canada Land Inventory, I believe is the term CLI.
Is there an opportunity to take a look at the cost to all of us for the loss of prime farmland, to say, hey, you know, if we destroy this for the next 100 years or more, that, you know, we're not going to have it? Is there a way to incorporate that into some of the fiscal outlook?
Yeah, well, it's Yes, there should be, and it's also the loss of natural heritage and the loss of wetlands. There's a whole lot of things, and that's something I've been looking at, and how do we incorporate, because some of the conservation areas, Niagara, for example, are doing that, and they're further ahead of some of the other local conservation areas, and figuring out how we can get that evaluation, because right now they're, as you point out, they're just considered externalities. They're not part of the cost, but we know that there is a real cost. So that's something that we do need to pursue. It's a really good point.
Yeah, and it sounds like a good opportunity for people to comment, because so many of these decisions come down to the hard cash. It comes down to the sort of provincial dollars and cents, above all else prioritization. Well, is there a way we can level the playing field and talk about these other services that are vital to our cities and all of our lives, and make sure that we're putting the value of that to us on there? Final question, because we're at the end of time, basically. We all come from environmental advocacy backgrounds, Environment Hamilton, Hamilton 350, environmental defense, you know, we're all climate groups. We know that all of the costs that we've been talking about, both in terms of human, natural, financial, they're all going to be exacerbated by climate change. What can we do at a municipal level to try to take that into account in things like this framework, and to realistically look at what the future ahead holds for us?
Bill, do you want to take that one?
I'll have a shot. I would say, remember that some climate policy always doesn't look like climate policy. The most important linchpin of climate-friendly design is getting to that density of 100 people per hectare, so people don't need to drive. It's about keeping development out of areas where they'll be subject to flooding, et cetera, and need to be torn down. And you know, one of the best climate policies, a lot of the best climate policies are precisely the same policies that you pursue if you were just trying to get more homes built faster. Switching from concrete to wood frame construction by eliminating minimum parking requirements is a climate solution. So I would say, like, you know, don't fall prey to this framing that, you know, you are balancing housing supply against climate. The solutions are the same. It's really a stick frame mid-rise without parking everywhere in your existing neighborhoods. Best for the climate, best for housing, get it done.
Great. Craig, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say good urbanism, is what Phil just outlined, is climate policy. It's simple as that. Land use and poor land use is one of the biggest contributors to our climate problems. You know, putting aside fossil fuels, of course, which is huge, but land use policy is right up there.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone else has learned a lot. And then I hope that everyone on this call takes that to the upcoming sessions next week, and that we, you know, pull a hat trick 3 for 3 in making Hamilton a leader, defending the firm urban boundary this time around. So thank you both so much. And for folks on this call, we're going to be sending out a follow-up email with the link that you can look at all that urban boundary expansion stuff. I know it's going to be shared in the chat as well as some comments that you might want to enter. So thanks so much.
You can tell that my kid is making fun of me for all the sports analogies. Knowing me, he was horrible for the 3 strikes and the yeah.
Oh, great. I think analogies are awesome, and they're good for making it clear to people that we can do this again. It feels like we've been in this fight for so long, but we can do it. We can keep on going. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Chip.
Thanks everyone for attending.